Philosophy at its beginning is just the love of wisdom. Now, what is wisdom? One can propose all kinds of ideas. I'm just going to suggest that wisdom has to do with knowing how to live in the world. And by that I mean it's more than simply knowing how to breathe and how to eat and things like that. It's knowing how to get along with people, how to get along with the divine, how to get along with the physical universe beyond ourselves, how to get along with ourselves. All of these questions are central to the philosophical program, and I think they were from the very start. We have a lot of the earliest people named philosophers that appear to be more physicists, really. They're more interested in what the components of things are. What the quotes we have from them are mostly about things like, well, Thales thought the world was mostly water, and Anaximenes posited that there was one substance that filled the whole universe, and he referred to the universe as being a plenum, completely filled. And we have Anaximander, who thought that everything was fire. Who cares? Except that in this investigation, they've arrived at these conclusions because they've dealt with things in the world. Their experiences of eclipses, of tides, of fires, and of the absence of vacuum, if that makes any sense. They're trying to explain how things fit together so they can see how we fit into it. This brings us to one of my favorite examples of the pre-Socratics, Zeno of Elea. Zeno proposed, following Parmenides, that the universe was a plenum. It was filled entirely with no space anywhere. Now he says, we look around and you see space. Now we know there's air and stuff in between me and the next thing, but as far as he was concerned, it was all just space. But he says it's not there. And he's not proposing the air. What he's proposing is that the senses lie to us. Now, for my money, that's a big breakthrough. It's not a breakthrough I want to support very much in many ways, but in other ways, you have to, okay? Why? Well, as science progresses, things which appear to be countersensual, say how blood, which looks red, becomes straw-colored with sort of brownish, rustyish spheres in it, the senses lie. We stick a rod into the water and it looks not joined. The senses lie. What then can we trust? Well, what the first philosophers begin to suggest is that we can trust reason. Now, there's a problem with trusting reason. Reason doesn't always go where we want to go. Our world, our worldview may well be irrational. And so listening to reason creates a problem. Nevertheless, Zeno supports reason. And this is why he gives us his famous paradoxes. Now, they aren't paradoxes, strictly speaking. He intends them as reductio ad absurdum, that the argument reduces one of your assumptions to an absurdity. And the thing that he says is reduced to an absurdity is motion. How can there be motion? Well, he knows from his standpoint that everything is basically just the one stuff throughout, all one, all filled. He knows that real motion doesn't exist. Oh, we think we see motion, but that just points to, again, the fallibility of the senses. What we can trust is reason, and reason tells us that whenever an arrow is shot, at any given moment, it's not moving. It's filling up the space it's in, and anything that fills up the space it's in isn't moving, because it's always going on to the next space. See, but it's not. It's right here in this space right now. Therefore, since there's no way for it to get to the next space, since it's in this space, and it's not moving, because if it was moving, it wouldn't be in one space. It would be in more than one space. He says, see, motion makes no sense. Forget about it. Yeah, you're going to sit there and try to strain your brain as to how to make sense, and he's saying, forget it. It doesn't make any sense. What makes sense is what I've told you. I can make good logical sense out of it for you. When he tells us the story of Achilles and the tortoise, he simply points out, look. In order to cover any distance, you have to cover half of that distance. In order to cover that distance, you have to cover half of that distance, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that's just a fact. There's no way of denying that in order to cover a whole of a distance, you first have to cover half of a distance. That's just good reasoning. So your senses are lying to you. There is no motion. Achilles does not chase the tortoise. Achilles does not move. The tortoise does not move. Not really. Again, we're told by modern physics quite often that what we think the world is, because of how we see it, is wrong. I gave an example from Berkeley, but just consider quantum mechanics. The idea, just stepping back up a level, atomic physics tells us that most of every atom is space. Therefore, most of every molecule is space. So how can I slap on that desk? My hand is mostly space. The desk is mostly space. How does that happen? It can't happen, says Zeno. What you have is an illusion. Reality is what is rational. Reality is what can be logically proven, numerically demonstrated. When you fall back on the senses, you make a mistake. We're going to have that in spades when we look at Plato. Anytime you look at Plato, because Plato is always basically about a higher reality than the one we live in. The one we live in is mere shadow, mere reflection, mere instantiation of the higher reality. Now, the next person I want to take a little time to talk about is Democratus. Now, Democratus is one of those fellows who gets pumped up a lot because, son of a gun, he used the word atom. Well, he didn't use the word atom, but the root of the word atom is there. Certainly, it's where we borrowed the word from. And all atom means is a tomos. It can't be divided. Divided? None. Not. Can't be divided further. So what he suggests, in order to explain how real motion can happen, is he's going to posit that same filled universe as Zeno. But unlike Zeno, He's going to say not that it's filled with some kind of force that fills everything, but rather with material particles. And that these material particles are always in motion. And he says what we see as individual objects, as individual motions, as changes in the world are just the atoms swerving around. Some are a little heavier than others, some are a little smaller than others, some move a little faster, some move a little slower, but they're all there, they're all the time, and there's nothing individualizable about them, really. The only thing he comes close to talking about a truly individual kind of atom is when he talks about soul atoms. And he says those are the very, very smallest, finest, teeny, weeniest little atoms, which is why life is such a fragile thing. That little atom, little collection of atoms that makes up our life, our soul, our spirit, our psyche, our thumos. Our pneuma is the finest, tiniest atoms. And so they swing away very easily, disperse amongst themselves, make new souls. It's all physical. It all is compartmentalized, componentized, because with this idea of not just being a block universe of solid stuff, the universe is like a jar of marbles that you might try to guess how many are in the jar. It's all packed full, but not so full that it can't shift around a little. This is especially true because they aren't all the same size. Everything is the same size, it's harder to get it to shift. But if everything is different sizes, then a little bit of shaking and everything shifts around. You can have a universe of motion without it being a universe with gaps in it. Because again, we take a look in that jar of marbles and it certainly looks like it's full. No room for anything else. Today, we think differently, but when he was there, that's what he was thinking. It's all filled, packed solid with these atoms. And as they shift around each other, we have the perception of change and the perception of motion, and it's a legitimate perception, and it's a meaningful shift and change, but the reality is it's all one, it's all there. But by acknowledging these different sizes and these different particles, we have at least introduced the idea of the many. Now, let's take a step to the side. Empedocles, about the same time, gives us his idea of the many, the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. But before these guys, we go back. See, Thales says everything is water. It's just water that changes. And Exmander says it's all fire, just fire that changes. It's all the Apiron, says Anaxagoras. But that's what, it shifts around, and so we see different parts of it. It's when we get to Democratus, the possibility is acknowledged that there could be more than one kind of stuff. There may only be big atoms and little atoms. There may only be heavy atoms and light atoms. It may be very, very fine atoms of soul or very coarse atoms of granite. But this is the introduction to the many. But you knew at some point somebody was going to come along and say, no, you got it all wrong. You keep talking about a higher reality. There's no higher reality. There's only this reality. There's only here and now, what I see, touch, and feel. Human beings are the measure of what there is and what there isn't. That our experiences of the world are of the world, because what we experience is the world. Someone comes to Greece from somewhere up north, and they find the weather unbearably hot. The Greeks are wearing their normal toga wear, and they're like, what's your problem, son? You know, a chiton is exactly the right thing for this weather. Keep your clothes on. And Protagoras says, you understand, it's all relative. It's relative to where you are, where you come from, what you see, what you're used to. Things aren't fixed. We make them what they are. They tell me that there was an umpire back in the 40s who, when asked what's a ball and what's a strike, replied to the reporter, if I call it a ball, it's a ball. If I call it a strike, it's a strike. It's got nothing to do with anything except what I call it. And that appears to be the world that Protagoras says we live in. We don't have enough to completely weigh all of it, and certainly Plato paints him in a very bad light, suggesting that he is trapped in a place where he has to say, yeah, everything's relative to me, and I'm relative to me, but you're relative to me, and I'm relative to you, and nonsensical talk. Protagoras seems to be suggesting when he says human beings are the measure of all things, not that any single individual human being is the measure of all things, but we, as a group, shape what we call the world. And maybe that's my pragmatism leaking on me. But there's at least one more thing I want to say about Protagoras before I let it go. Protagoras is one of the first philosophers to be charged with making the weaker argument appear to be the stronger. But how can the weaker argument appear to be the stronger? It can't. Now, what can be the case is the what argument you think should lose wins. I mean, in the end, that's what makes an argument weak or strong, is it convincing? We resist Zeno's argument, however logically sound it may or may not be, because it affects the way we see the world. If you're a Westerner, you're probably, certainly if you're an Anglo-American Westerner, you tend to see the world the way our intellectual forebears did as empiricists. So you want to see that the senses are real. So if Zeno says, oh no, they're not, well, you want to push back because you don't want to hear that. But it's what you don't want to hear. It's not that Zeno is wrong. The several counterexamples that are offered by Aristotle to Zeno really don't appear as convincing as he thinks they are. To say, well, it's not really the case that rest means that you fill the space up. Well, what else does rest mean? Okay, we can talk about things like impetus, but again, at any given moment, physics tells us we can balance the equation so that it is at rest. Logic says one thing, experience says another. And this is an ongoing story throughout philosophy. Usually, not always, but usually when someone is saying they make the worse seem the better cause, the weaker seem the stronger argument, what they really mean is they're able to argue something I don't want to have as the outcome. Now, I'm sure there are times when we can make the weaker seem stronger through the personality of the presenter of the argument or the words used to present the argument in the text. But in the end, the weaker argument is the one that does not convince. And so you can't make the stronger argument appear weaker, because if it was actually stronger, it would actually have convinced. Hope this gives you a little something to think about. Gives you some perspective on the earliest philosophers. Keep on thinking about it. Keep on talking philosophy.